Happy Monday. Man, people are pouring in. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. I see some faces, I see some pictures, I see some names, but nonetheless, I am so grateful for your presence today and you joining us and being in space with us today as we continue our conversation talking about intimate partner violence. So good to see you all. As you come in today, I'm going to ask that you would, in the chat, let us know your name, where you're joining from, and let's say one thing you're grateful for on this Monday. Just one thing that you are grateful for. I want to call a couple of those things out. And I am super excited about today's topic, not just the intimate partner violence series, but really talking about our system response to IPV. How do our systems work together to support survivors and their children? So let's see what we got. What are we grateful for? Oh, hi from Kentucky. Grateful to be here, Brenna. Thank you. See a lot of, somebody said they're grateful for a sound mind. Awesome. Family. Able to work from home while sick. I want you to take care of yourself, Emily. I'm grateful you're able to work from home too, but take care of yourself. I'm grateful for the concert, right? Cameron said they went to a concert last night. I hope you had a blast. So good to see you all. Grateful for family. Yeah, that seems to be a consistent thing. Grateful for nature, grateful for health, grateful for a beautiful fall day. Man, so many things to be grateful for. And so I just always love to make sure we center ourselves in gratitude because there is so much to be grateful for, while there's also so much to grieve, right? So much going on in our country and in our nation and in our world. And so thank you all again for being here. So let's get started. I want to say welcome again. Some of you all, this may be your first time. Some of you all, you have been here from the start of this series. I want to say welcome. Today's in-tech session is entitled Supporting Systems to Support Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence. This is the fourth session. Man, time is really flying by. This is the fourth session in our Intimate Partner Violence Awareness Month series. And again, we are so happy that you have taken time out of your busy day to be with us. So let's keep our momentum going. I want to share with you just a brief disclaimer. We don't anticipate any challenges, but we like to just make sure that we have some things in place. The first thing is we want you to know that this presentation was prepared by INTAC under a cooperative agreement with SAMHSA. While this event is supported by SAMHSA, and we appreciate the support, the contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of SAMHSA, HHS, or the U.S. government. Also, we don't anticipate any issues as it relates to our security of this session, but if there's any breach in our security, we will immediately end this session, and we will email out a new link for you all to join. So we just like for you all to know what we have in place, just in case anything like that should happen. So just a little bit about what we're going to do today. Our agenda is pretty straightforward. I'm welcoming you now. I'll give a little bit of an INTAC overview for those who this may be your first time joining. And then I'll do a little grounding as it relates to IPV and systems. We'll talk a little bit about why would I put those together? Why are we having a conversation about system response? We'll talk about that. We'll show a brief video clip called The Story of Rachel, because we always like to center the voice of survivors. And I think this video clip helps to do that. And you'll get a little bit more information as we share that. You'll see why. And then we'll have a panel discussion with some amazing experts in the area of IPV, all of which I have had the opportunity to work with at one point or another, and who really have a system lens and have done the work on the ground, right, in states, in organizations, really thinking about the system response. And so I'm really grateful for their presence today. And then we'll leave some time for any questions that you all might have. for the panel. We'll make sure that we get to that as well. And then we'll wrap up. So a little bit about NTAC. NTAC is not just one organization, but we really are we come together around mental health, but it really takes a systemic response, right? It's all of us coming together as partners to do this work. We utilize our expertise and our subject matter knowledge to help inform the field by creating products, resources, and sessions like this one to enhance the behavioral and mental health fields. And so you'll see some of our partners represented on the screen. We have CARS, or the Center for Applied Research and Solution, who is the prime or the lead organization in NTAC. And then you'll see partners like the University of Texas at Austin. We have FRETLA, who's our family leader organization, Change Matrix, which is the organization that I am employed by. We have Youth Moves National, so that we can make sure that the voices of young people are also centered in our work. We have the Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and then we also have Georgetown University Hospital. Also, we want you to know that our vision as a center is that all children, youth, and families who are living with or impacted by mental health challenges will have access to the resources and opportunities that they need to thrive in both a comprehensive and equitable system of care. And so we serve a wide, wide cross-sector audience. We have so many different partners from different fields and systems. We have providers, we have school workforce, infant and early childhood providers, you name it, we have them at the table. And our services range from individual consultation to more in-depth sessions like the one we are offering today. We also provide peer learning exchanges and tools to help support you in your work. And so we really want you to visit our website and take a look at what we have to offer. And if there's something that we can do to support you in your work, we want you to, to please do reach out. All of our services are free of charge. And so we invite you to take advantage of those resources. And there's some commonly asked questions that we get throughout our session. So we like to kind of try to answer those up front. And so we want you to know that you will receive a certificate of completion after this event. So please check your email and you'll be able to get that. Also, this session is being recorded. And so that recording will be sent to all of those who registered, in addition to any slides that we share. If you have any other questions, you can always email J Bloom at the email that you see on the screen. And I'm sure you probably have received the email from her as it relates to this offering. So you can follow up with any questions that you have that haven't been already answered. All right, so let's talk more about supporting systems to support survivors of intimate partner violence. And as I'm talking, I want you all to go ahead and chat in. What systems do you see, just kind of as you think about intimate partner violence and the way that it impacts survivors and children and families and communities? I want you just to chat in. What systems kind of come to mind? What systems do you see as playing a really key role in supporting survivors? So as I'm talking, I want you to just go ahead and just chat what comes to your mind. That would be very helpful. I want to remind you all that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and this is why we chose October to do this series. This month really is a time for victim advocates, professionals, survivors of abuse, loved ones of those who have been abused, and communities to come together and mourn the lives that have been lost to domestic violence. We cannot lose sight of the fact that this takes lives, right? We also use this month to celebrate the progress that has been made to end this epidemic and to connect with others who are working to create a change. And so we like to make sure that we know that as well. So it's just not breast cancer awareness, which is also critically important, but it's also Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Before we get into our conversation today, I want to just really point out the need to take care of yourself. We know that IPV is a sensitive topic. that might be triggering for those who may have experienced or witnessed violence. And so we want you to please take advantage of the resources that we have on the screen and also in the chat. We have listed the National Domestic Violence Hotline that you can call or text if you are in need of support. And if you need to step away, if you need to turn your camera off, whatever you need to do to take care of you, we want to invite you to do that. So these are our wonderful presenters today. I'm going to give their bios in just a second, but I want you to just look at this array of just expertise. And yeah, I'm just excited that each of them have come and joined today. So I'll introduce them again in just a minute, but I wanted to acknowledge them and show you their beautiful profile pictures on the screen. So again, just a little bit about them in just a minute. And I don't think I've introduced myself. Some of you all may have seen me a time or two, but I am Dr. Gia Kelly, and I am one of the project directors here at INTAC, and I have the opportunity of leading being the director of transformation teams here, but also have done about 10 years of advocacy on behalf of survivors for IPV. So I just wanted to add that. All right, so IPV and systems. I want to state that this is the definition that we'll be using when we talk about IPV in this entire series, because you'll hear intimate partner violence, you'll hear domestic violence being used interchangeably. But I want us to know, when we say intimate partner violence, what are we talking about? And intimate partner violence, according to the Office of Violence Against Women, is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one partner to gain or maintain power and control over another partner. All right. So it's important that we have shared language. So when you hear intimate partner violence, when you hear domestic violence, this is what we are talking about. We're not talking just about those who are in a current relationship, but it can happen in a relationship that has ended as well. It can still meet the criteria for intimate partner violence. So I wanted to share this definition with you for us to ground ourselves in it. So survivors and systems, I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing what systems came to mind for you all. And I'm seeing things like DV shelters and advocates play a critical role, parenting support, mental health services, CPS, wow, housing, shelters, medical care, law enforcement. You all are on a roll, judicial system, children and families. Yes, legal aid, advocates. You all are right on it. Therapists play a critical role. Yes, all of this is so critically important to the safety and well-being of survivors and their children. I want to state that IPV not only affects the physical and mental health of survivors. So often we think about those impacts, but it can also have a lasting impact on their employment, on their housing. So we saw people talk about these various systems needing to be at the table, medical coverage, parental custody, immigration status. Man, the list goes on and on. And so we want to make sure that folks understand that IPV and its impacts, again, go beyond the black eye and the broken arm, right? It goes beyond even just what, the initial safety concerns that may be at play, but it can have lasting effects for years on survivors and their children. Survivors must often navigate multiple systems at the same time. So I heard someone talk about CPS. Yes. You're talking about children in the home. So you're bringing in child welfare organizations who may or may not have a trauma-informed lens, who do not know how to support survivors. Children are at risk of being taken from survivors who themselves are victims, right? In these cases, we see where they're also trying to get not just custody issues, but there's judicial issues. They are trying to get, restraining orders and injunctions and things like that. So they have to navigate all of these systems at the same time. And we work in systems, but if you had to navigate systems, I'm sure you understand that it can be quite the ride, right? Especially if you don't understand how that system works. So just put yourself, I want you to put on your empathy hat, and I want you to imagine what that might feel like to be a victim of a crime, to be violated physically, mentally, emotionally, all these various ways, and then be put into all of these systems who are also blaming you. To be put in all of these systems who are saying, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And you're like, wait, I'm a victim here. There's no other victims really that go through what IPV survivors go through. All right. They're not blamed in the same way. So you may hear this. We'll talk about victim blaming and how systems blame victims a lot of the times for the violence, and why that is so harmful as we try to support survivors. Survivors who have been marginalized and historically oppressed experience greater systemic barriers. So survivors who identify as Black, Indigenous, otherwise people of color, those who are a part of the LGBTQ population, those who are living in poverty, who don't have resources, they experience greater barriers. And thus we need to understand how intersectionality works and how systems have to really, really do extra work to help those survivors, because they don't have resources oftentimes, right? There's systemic trauma. There's a lot that happens. And so we need to keep that in our forefront as well as we're thinking about our support of survivors. So this quote really talks about, from Cooper, really shows the intersection between intimate partner violence and poverty. And what Cooper says is abuse occurs at all income levels, but looking at numbers from the CDC and the American Psychological Association, it is clear that the lower the income, the higher the prevalence for abuse. And poverty can be a cause of domestic violence, and domestic violence can be a cause of poverty. So we don't even think about that. Not only is the survivor's life at risk, right? But also they can now live in poverty as a result of the violence that they have experienced. All right. So we need to understand, again, the intersectional nature of IPV, and that it does not just affect one aspect of the survivor's life, but every aspect. Every aspect. So I want to introduce this concept of the coordinated community response. And if you have ever worked in domestic or sexual violence, you have probably heard of this. But I think it's critical because it really aligns with the system of care model that we're implementing in mental health. And the idea is that it takes more than one system, one organization to truly support a survivor, that it requires a community response, a systemic response, right? In order to adequately address intimate partner violence, to hold perpetrators accountable for the violence, and to help survivors to reach safety. Since the inception of the CCR, or the Coordinated Community Response Model, back in the mid-1980s, these teams have brought together key players in community systems to develop strategies and procedures that were aimed at strengthening community and systems response to domestic violence and sexual assault. CCRs, they must go beyond the legal system. So often we only limit the response to the police. She needs to just call the police. He needs to just put a restraining order on the other person. It's not that simple, right? Sometimes. And sometimes the judicial system fails. Can we just acknowledge that sometimes it doesn't work? What happens if the perpetrator is a police officer? Right? And so those are things that we have to think about. So it must go beyond just the legal system. In order to create a true, wide network of support for victims, we must think about all of the other systems, the school system, the mental health system, all these other systems that play a critical support. And it's also important, especially important, for communities of color, people with disabilities, older adults, and other survivors that are from marginalized communities. That they really need systemic support. An effective CCR team will include members from schools, mental health. That means everybody in this call, you play a role in supporting survivors. Healthcare, neighborhood centers, faith communities, county extension agencies, cultural specific organizations, and many other groups play a role in this coordinated community response. So you can see how when we think about system of care, how they really do overlap in really thinking systemically about how to address both of these. Both IPV and mental health have a similar approach. All right. And I think this graphic just really hones in on the diverse set of systems that are at the table at these CCR convenings. That when we think about a coordinated response, we're thinking about law enforcement, we're thinking about faith, we're thinking about vocational, right, services, we're thinking about child and family services, we're thinking about health systems. And so I think this visual really helps us to get an idea of who would be a part of that coordinated community response. All right, so as we transition, I am going to show a brief video that's called The Story of Rachel. And I think this really helps us, will help us to get an idea of what survivors have to navigate as they navigate systems, all right? So it's a very brief video, and then after that, we'll go right into our panel discussion. So let me make sure that I am sharing sound. Give me one moment.
All right, your turn, Portia. Come on, guys.
Mom, can we play till I win?
Audrey, it's been so crazy around here.
Girl, what did he do now?
Girl, I did it. I called the police on his ass and they took him out of here.
Oh, my goodness.
Mom, I got into the band. Miss Peters said I'm good enough to play the violin.
Mommy is so proud of you. I just want you to know that I knew you could do it.
Hey, what do you think we should do for Mom's birthday? How about a surprise party? That'd be a great one.
Mom, when is Dad coming back? I hope he's here for Christmas.
Daryl, are you ready to go?
Baby, you know I didn't mean to do that. You know how much you and the kids mean to me. What can I do to make
No. Calvin, I've heard it too many times before.
Mom, those people are at the door again.
Oh, all right. Just tell him I'll be down there. Just go downstairs and wait. I'm on my way.
What did you do? Why these people tell me I can't see my kids? Oh, you're gonna pay for this. Rachel, you listening to me?
Mom, can I have a friend over tomorrow?
Portia, I don't know, okay?
But Mom,
I'm very busy.
Dara got to have a friend over last week.
Ms. Williams, I'm calling to inform you that you're past due on your phone bill. Would you be able to make a payment by the 30th?
I don't know. I really don't know. Hey. Don't cry. Hush. Listen, those kids don't know anything about you. You are a wonderful child. You are a beautiful girl.
Hey, Mom, Pastor Freud called. He wants to know if we could sing at church. I told him we will.
But Daryl, oh.
Mom, don't forget I have basketball practice after school.
I won't forget, Portia. I would never forget. When is it?
Mom, I don't feel good.
You don't feel good like what?
Don't hang up. Just let me tell you. Hey, the last time I talked to you, I was just really upset. Just, let's just work this thing out.
Calvin, no. It doesn't work like that, okay? Audrey, I do not know what I'm going to do. Girl, they are evicting me. I mean, I won't have a place to live. Girl, what am I supposed to tell my kids?
I know y'all miss me, right? Is Mom taking good care of y'all? Now, you know I'm gonna be home as soon as I can, but it's up to your mom.
Mom, when is Dad coming home?
I don't think Dad will be coming back home, honey.
He wants to come home, but he says he won't let him.
Oh, baby.
Mom, I aced my spelling test. Can we go shopping? Mom, can you tell Dara to get out of my space?
She started it.
Did not.
Did too.
Stop it!
right. So that is Rachel's story, and we are going to move into our panel discussion. But I want you just to write one word in the chat after watching that. Just what feeling do you have right now? How was it to watch that? I see exhausted, heartbreaking, hopeless, yeah, relentless. Someone said I can relate. Yeah, devastating, broken, absolutely. I think I feel all of that, right? We all feel all of that. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing so that we can have our discussion together, but I want to introduce our panelists for today. And if we can look like everybody's spotlight, great. All right. So I want to introduce our panelists for today. Our first panelist is Brandy Carlson Moore. Brandy is the president of Strategic Empowerment Consulting and holds a Master of Social Work degree from Florida State University with a specific focus in organizational administration and policy. After over 20 years in the business and nonprofit sectors, she has a deep and diverse skill set working with adult and child survivors of domestic violence, and the systems they interact with to access safety and security. She also works as a first responder mental health and works on first responder mental health and consults with organizations on burnout, strategic planning, grant writing, and issues related to governance and funding distribution. Brandy is married to her best friend and has 2 little ones that keep her busy and growing daily. So if you all can help me in welcoming Brandy today, you can just do some virtual claps and all that kind of stuff. Our next panelist is Angie Pye. Angie has been working in the field of domestic violence for 25 years and has expertise in advocacy, systems advocacy, child welfare, and substance misuse among these populations. I also want to add that Angie has worked at the community level as an executive director of a domestic violence shelter. So we're talking about someone who's just not sitting at the state level making decisions, but has worked with survivors and probably can tell more stories than we can of the ways in which systems have impacted survivors. So Angie, thank you so much for being here today. We can also give a hands up for Angie. And then last but not least, we have Arlene Vassell. And I've had the privilege of knowing all 3 of them, so I love them all. But I just lost my slide. Sorry. But Arlene has over 25 years of multifaceted experience within the movement to end gender-based violence. She is a sought-after speaker, training, and thought leader. Her advocacy journey has been dedicated to ending and preventing gender-based violence, disrupting systems and structures of inequities, of inequalities and oppression, promoting leadership advancement of people of color within the movement, and developing equity-centered, trauma-informed, culturally relevant programming and practices. For the last 25 years, Arlene has worked alongside and on behalf of individuals whose lives have been impacted by domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, homelessness, human trafficking, substance use, poverty, and other life-altering situations. So help me in welcoming Arlene. Thank you so much. So we are going to dive right in. And this is going to be a conversation. We're talking about systems. We're talking about 25 plus years of experience among our panelists. Just a lot of good experience. So my first question for you all, and I'm going to throw a question out there. It's whoever wants to jump in. I'm not going to necessarily tailor it to a specific person, but I will pull on you if I feel like you have something, because I know your experience and expertise. But my first question is, as we think about a systems response to IPV, what stands out to you most as you watch Rachel's story? What came to mind? And anyone can start that conversation.
I think I'll start. Just everything that everyone, dropped in the chat resonated with me. And the main thing that I was thinking, and as we're thinking about system responses, for me, I immediately thought about like, how did all the systems that have been engaging with the family fail them?
Mm,
And it's the family, right? So it's
yeah.
everybody that's involved. How did all the systems fail them? And oftentimes, as service providers, we don't focus on basic needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can do a lot of education, we can do a lot of advocacy. We can check boxes. I'm gonna
Mm-hmm.
keep it real because I'm one of those type of speakers,
Mm-hmm.
right? We check boxes, but we don't think about basic needs, right? And until you address basic needs, people will not be able to thrive and or survive, right? My goal is thriving, but people just won't be able to survive. So for me, it's how did the systems fail the families?
Mm-hmm.
Mothering continues beyond abuse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And are we focusing on mothering? All the
Mm-hmm.
things that are needed to continue to show up as a mother, show up as a survivor, and navigate all these systems that you talked about, right? And so that's what immediately came up for me. Like, mothering continues beyond abuse. And
Mm-hmm.
we oftentimes think about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Arlene.
I just noticed that there were some folks in the chat that shared that they are survivors of intimate partner violence. And so I just wanted to say thank you for sharing that and for being here and for your continued work in whatever capacity that is, working with survivors and their kids. And one of the things that the story of Rachel always brings up for me, and I've showed it in training so many times, and it never loses its impact. It's always so powerful to watch, and you pick up different things because there's so much going on in the video, which kind of highlights how much is on her mental load and how much she's going through and experiencing. But one of the things that to kind of boil it down, it comes back to something that as domestic violence advocates, you find yourself just beating your head against the wall, for lack of a better way to say it, in terms of like, why doesn't she just leave? That's the mentality from so many of in the field, so many other system partners and just community members, friends and family of survivors. Things like, I would never stay in a relationship that was like that. I would get out right away. And so in those terms, when we think that way and when we have that mentality, and especially as we're voicing that to the survivor themselves, it just makes that so much harder for the survivor to access safety for themselves and their child, because we're missing so much about their experience and the challenges that they're facing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brandy. And
And
you had anything?
I can ditto all that, but also every time I watch this, what always gets me is that last frame where it says Rachel has become increasingly uncooperative. And I'm sure as many people that are on this this webinar, we've all seen that language, particularly in child welfare paperwork and people coming back. And so you hear her kind of the strength in her voice in the beginning, and I think they do a great job with this video of so kind of seeing that exasperation towards the end of, I need to think, everybody leave me alone. Like, you can kind of hear that in her. And then because those systems are not communicating, everybody's walking in her door as if they're the only system she's dealing with, and no idea what she dealt with earlier that day, or what's going on with the kids, or the family pressure, or the church pressure, or the batterer's pressure. So that's the thing that always gets me at the end with that, is that statement, and the fact that we as advocates really need to have grace, and systems need grace, and to think about what is this person gone through today, and to give them the space to kind of say how they are, and let us know where they're at today before we start piling more things on her.
Yeah.
Gia, one thing to add to what Angie just said, and for me it's that phrase as well, because that's where the labeling starts. Right. So as advocates, language matters. So when you get notes and you pass notes on, and when you talk about people, right, and you use that type of language, then that just takes away from the service that this person will receive from others, because language matters and language is powerful.
Absolutely. And I think when I see this video again, I've watched it several times over the course of doing this work. But my question is always, what is dad doing? What is dad doing other than calling and using the children as pawns? I don't know if you all caught the manipulation, right? It's up to your mom. It's her, it's the blaming, the subtle blaming that happens. And so all of the pressure is on mom to mom, right? But what is dad required to do other than maybe show up to court every now and then? But he's not experiencing the same pressure of the lights about to get cut off, right? Because in most situations, he may be the one who has most of the money, or who's working and was allowed to work. And so there's so many pieces that puts a lot of pressure on mom. And it's like, how does she not break? How does she not scream? So those are things to definitely keep in mind. So my next question for you all, the panelists, is both the systems of care approach to mental health and the coordinated community response and IPV focus on cross-sector collaboration. And so my question is, in your experience, from where you have sat in your various roles within the advocacy movement, why is it important for systems to work together to support survivors and their children? Why is that critical to their safety and well-being?
I'll start this time, but one thing that I've always seen, especially later after a homicide occurs, and we're reflecting back on that case and looking at the things that happened, is that a lot of people have information sometimes that they don't know is important, to talk about. And confidentiality, of course, is the utmost importance, and we always need to maintain that. But there are times where I think that as the experts, it's important for us to have that conversation with the survivor too, about what the experience is like, and if we can bring people to the table so there is a more holistic response and people are all on the same page. Because so many times after a death has occurred, one of the things that has really stood out to the groups reviewing those is these piecemeal pieces of information that, had we just known, would it have made a difference? Could this person have, been saved? And obviously the responsibility of that is always on the perpetrator. But as we communicate and improve systems, even just knowing that if you can't communicate, having the mutual respect among the systems for each other, to know that if I'm pausing on something, or I'm telling you something that doesn't make sense to you, that you trust us enough, especially as from a shelter standpoint, working in the shelters, that was a big conversation with child welfare. I need you to trust me enough to know that I'm going to protect the children and I'm going to protect the survivor. And if there's something that we need to talk about, we're going to do it. And if I'm not saying things, it's important for the safety and the confidentiality of this family. And so I think there's ways to work together without everybody sharing every little bit of information that they have. But a lot of that comes too with the cooperation among the systems and the learning to trust each other as systems and work within our areas of expertise to really serve this family and give them what they need.
And Angie, you bring out a good point, is that piece around when we're talking about intimate partner violence, confidentiality it goes to another level. And sometimes with other service providers, it can be frustrating because advocates, especially we can speak on in the state of Florida, there's another level of protection that's given to advocates, and we can't share information. And so that can be frustrating because the therapist wants this and the child protection wants this, and but the confidentiality or the privilege is really because safety is such a big piece of this. Like, this person can be killed if the wrong information goes, and this perpetrator can go to the school and get records and go to this and get records. And so it's just important to understand that for those who may work in other systems, that it may be a little bit of a challenge in navigating that, but understand at the end of the day, it's about the survivor's safety. That is that is most important. Arlene or Brandy, did you have anything about collaboration and why that's important?
Yeah, just basically some of what you just said, I think is very important, right, around the confidentiality, but the conversations need to happen, right? So it's the cross training. Cross training is a part of collaboration where people are learning other people's systems and learning the limitations of each system. So I think the collaboration piece, oftentimes people don't think about the cross training piece, right? So I think cross training is important, and why I believe that we need cross-system collaboration when we talk about intersectionality, because it's a buzzword, right? But when we actually provide services using an intersectional approach, no one organization has the resources and the expertise, right, to provide a holistic approach. So you really do have to connect across systems so people can bring their expertise to conversations that then can support survivors and their children.
Good point. Anything else on this collaboration? So much going on in the chat. And I'm going to ask, just as because it's a little hard to listen to the panel and keep up with the chat. So I'm going to ask that you will put questions in the chat. And I love you all sharing your experiences, but sometimes it can be distracting trying to read and keep up. So I just want us to be mindful of that. But if you have any specific questions, you can feel free to chat those or hold those until the end. But I appreciate you all sharing your stories and experiences. It just got me like this. Anything, Brandy, or we can move to the next question.
Yeah, I just, in kind of thinking about what Arlene just shared and what you both shared too, I remember being a young advocate with, very little life experience, very little experience with the child welfare system, and in many ways, and starting out in the work, trying to do the best that I could to support survivors, but also knowing when survivors were talking about their experiences, for example, with the child welfare system or with the criminal justice system, not having enough knowledge to be able to really help them navigate those systems, and how important that cross training is for staff. Thankfully, in the situation I was working with, there were other more experienced advocates also doing case management with these survivors, but I always reflect on that in terms of our own ability, wherever we sit in response to the survivor, their kids, the perpetrator, how important it is for us to learn about each other's systems, so that we can do the best that we can. Not that you can be an expert in everything, of course, but domestic violence, intimate partner violence really is its own specialty. It's its own area of expertise that one can learn about, needs to learn about if you're working with survivors. So that's all.
Good stuff. Yeah, thank you, Brandy. The next question is, we talk a lot about survivors, their safety, how systems, I hate to use that phrase. I was just going to say, I don't even want to say it. Trying to get away from violent language, but I was going to say basically hold survivors accountable, and all of that. But my question to you is, what role should systems play in holding perpetrators accountable in your opinion and experience? What does that look like? Because I think sometimes we keep them out of the conversation, right? So what role does systems play in that?
I've seen some really amazing things happen in communities with a coordinated community response to domestic violence, and especially in regard to holding perpetrators accountable. And unfortunately, we don't see it enough. But when it works, it really makes significant change. And I've heard, partners at the table saying, 2 years ago, we would have not even looked at this guy, or this person, this perpetrator. We would not have, they would not have gone to jail. There would be no sanctions. There would be no response. And now that we're working together, the prosecution, the law enforcement, child welfare, the domestic violence center, mental health, substance abuse providers, all of those folks at the table, and being able to share what they can, and being able to say, hey, you can't do anything in your role right now, but I can. And here's what I'm going to do. Here's what my office can do to make sure that we're enhancing the safety of the survivor, that we're holding the perpetrator accountable. And so, I love, those situations, those communities that have really been able to do that work well. And it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of collaboration and humility and problem solving, and it takes the ability to learn how to sustain it too. Because if it's just about a couple of people at the table, and it's not built into the fabric of the community and the fabric of the organizations through policy and all the other aspects, it most likely will not last.
Good stuff, Randy. And I think for me, as soon as you ask the question, Gia, and it's a question that we get often because we talk about accountability a lot. And for me, it's who gets to determine what accountability looks like. Right. So I would ask that question back to systems, like who is making that decision? And as we're talking about accountability, are we also talking about systemic oppression, systemic racism, oppression? How does that show up? Oftentimes when we talk about accountability, some people are deemed to be deserving of grace and, and then some other people are thrown away, right? So it's all these different things that we're talking about when we're talking about different communities and different cultures. When we talk about accountability, it looks different in various cultures. So are we in tune with that, right? And are we imposing our beliefs into that conversation, right? And how are survivors being looped into that conversation around accountability? And so also as a part of accountability, yes, holding individuals who cause harm, because I like that language, holding individuals who cause harm accountable, and also what support, right? What does that person need? And oftentimes we don't think about that. I know it took me years in this movement to even think about what does individuals who cause harm, what do they need as well, right? Because oftentimes it took a long time actually for me to even get into that space. But now I understand, going into particular communities, you have to provide services to the entire family and the entire community, and that includes individuals who cause harm.
No, and I think, when we're thinking about most of the audience today is, works in mental health in some capacity. And so there is a concern, right? Like, well, what makes a person cause harm? What is their childhood trauma? We tend to see a lot of that in the chat. And I think there is an acknowledgement of that yes, what did we say? Hurt people hurt people. And so there is absolutely truth that they've gone through many, harm doers or perpetrators have gone through really bad childhood, have seen, witnessed violence. So we acknowledge that, but that does not lessen the responsibility, right, that we place on them for causing harm. And I think that's when we talk about perpetrator accountability or whatever, that's what we're talking about, that they still are responsible for the harm, right, that is caused to survivors and their children. And I want to also acknowledge that there's a lot of, I saw a couple posts talking about, that we're overlooking the harm that is done to children who are witnessing. And I want to acknowledge that absolutely not. Our last session was totally focused on the impact of violence on children and what that means. But I think what happens in systems, and I can speak for this because this was my work, was working alongside child welfare, is that our response cannot be blaming mom or blaming the victim, because our child welfare systems are typically mom-centered. That's the way they were created. They were maternal in nature. Mom is looked at the primary caregiver, And so mom has all of the responsibility. And so what child welfare has to understand is when you look at the research and when you look at protective factors, that child needs mom. If she's a non-offending parent, if she has not caused harm to that child and has been as protective as she could be within her right, then you need to keep mom and child together. But so often we like to blame mom. You didn't leave, so I'm going to snatch these children. And how much trauma is done in those cases. And so that is the work that has to be done with child welfare. And that's, you know, the reform that has to happen in thinking about these cases, like they're not cut and dry. So we acknowledge that harm is done to children, but we also acknowledge that the best practice is to try to keep the mom and the child together if mom is in fact non-offending and non-abusive. So I just wanted to add to that. Angie, you have anything to add? It looks like you had something.
Well, I'll just add, I think the role of these systems is to start asking the right questions too.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so many times we're asked, you know, we brought it up earlier. Why do they say, why don't people leave? You know, that should solve the issue. And we know that doesn't solve the issue. And I think that when those systems start asking what makes this individual think that they can cause harm with impunity, that speaks to the culture of the community. So if we're asking that question, we're stepping onto a path to really explore as systems, what are we doing that makes these individuals think that it's not going to be a big deal. They'll go do a few hours in jail and everything will be okay tomorrow and the case will get dropped, or because many of them feel that they can commit these acts with impunity. So I think it's all the systems' responsibility to start asking the right questions. And how are we enhancing safety for survivors and their children, increasing their ability to care for their kids and have that well-being in their homes, but also addressing this person who causes harm, because that's what's going to solve the issue, not just shelters and services for the people who didn't commit a crime. We have to have that stuff for the people who did commit the crime.
Mm-hmm. And Angie, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot just because I see a couple of questions with folks really asking about, and Brandy, you kind of started a little bit of the conversation around the coordinated community response and how does that look like in community? And Angie, since you worked in community for a long time in shelters as a leader, I'm just wondering if you have an example that you can share, again, with no identifying information, where a coordinated response worked. Do you have any examples that you can share? Because folks are like, I want to know what that looks like. We're talking about it, but they want an actual example.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had a lot. I'd love to have more, but I still have contact with people who went through the systems, and even though it may have been rocky, we came together at the table and did what was right. And I have one woman that comes to mind right now that in her situation, her children were removed. Again, was a case where they shouldn't have removed. We got the kids back to her in about 48 hours, and she relocated, restabilized. She started her own nonprofit to serve families who need these resources now. So I think that there has been many cases where what it looked like was not the organized CCR type response, but what it looked like was us picking up the phone and going, we have to talk about this. What are we doing in situations like this? And that's what prompted the change down the road. I mean, I think that there's got to still be a lot of that kind of thing happening on a pretty daily basis, in addition to your monthly meetings and your subcommittees and your groups that are working on that best practice. You've got to be willing to pick up the phone and have conversations and say, let's talk about a situation like this. What are we going to do in the future? What's our values as a community? And are we rooting in those when we're making these decisions or taking these actions?
Yeah. And I think we have so many more examples, and I can probably think of a lot of them, where survivors were killed because there was a lack of communication.
Yes. Yeah.
We have so many more examples of that. And so it's not that the coordinated community response model doesn't work. It's that if we do it, it works, but it's just putting the effort, right? And that's with anything. We can't, we can't do anything. We can't really solve any social issue, right? Without everybody being at the table, having a shared vision and a vested interest in safety of our communities. And that we all play a role. And Brandy, I think you highlighted that beautifully, was like, look, I can't do this, but you can, and I might not know that unless we have those conversations that Angie, you were talking about. And I think that's the beauty also of advocacy, is that advocates are willing to say, hey, I'll stay on this phone. So, until somebody picks up, because that's the role of an advocate. And so I just want to highlight how critical having an advocate is for survivors. If they're open to one. So for those of you who work in mental health and you're, have clients or families that are experiencing, as much as you can build relationships with your local domestic violence shelters and programs and advocates, that's just a really good resource, because they can go above and beyond. They're not 9 to 5 typically, they are willing to sit in courtrooms and have conversations with child protective services on behalf of that survivor and what they want. And so I just love to lift that up. So we're going to move along. Such good stuff, man. I hope you all are enjoying this. I see again some hearts and hands up in the chat. So I think it's going over really, really well. My question to the panel is, many of the people that are looking, that will review this replay, that are in this session today, work in mental health in some role, in some way. Whether they're families or, they have their families of those impacted by it, they're therapists and clinicians. They work in a number of different areas. What do you see as is the role that mental health can play, mental health providers? What role do they play in supporting survivors and children from your experience and the various roles that you all have worked in? How important is mental health to this whole systemic response? Arlene, I think you're talking, but you muted.
No, I said, okay, I'll go. For me, I just keep thinking about, again, when you talked about connecting with domestic violence organizations, and so being proactive with that, right? And really, really building relationships so that you all can co-create policies and practices and responses that are trauma informed, that are survivor centered. And another thing that I thought about is do your internal work. Right? What does your internal work look like as an individual and within your organization as it relates to, biases, your healing process, right? So yes, doing your internal work, building relationships ahead of time, being proactive, not reactive, and then offering a wide array of options for individuals, right? Because if you're gonna be culturally relevant, culturally sensitive, then you will need to have, resources to offer a wide array of options to survivors and their children. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, one of the things.
Go ahead, Brandy.
I was just thinking about in terms of mental health providers and their potential intersection with child welfare partners. They may be child welfare partners themselves, but how we talked earlier about documentation and how important the language, I think Arlene mentioned that, how important the language we use in our documentation and the way that we're approaching families where there's IPV happening. But this one thing, the reports that go to CPS, the reports that go to the child welfare system have just been so difficult in my experience working and intersecting with the child welfare system for many years, and creating just so much more challenge for survivors in their experience and trying to keep their kids safe. And so just encouraging folks to be cognizant of the way that that documentation looks on paper. Obviously you're truthful, you're, you know, talking about what's really happening, the services that are being provided, but the way that we frame that, and if we're partnering with survivors, and if we're talking with them in that way where we're saying, look, I'm on your side, I'm on your team, and I want to support you in every way that I can, and we're really tailoring our response to that individual, rather than, you know, sometimes all of us get in the routine of saying, I've been here before, I've worked with this same type of case before, I've worked with the same type of person before, and we have to continue to check ourselves on that kind of stuff. So we are continuously looking at people as individuals and tailoring our work and our support to them.
Thank you for that. And do you have anything to add?
No, I think I ditto both of them at this point too. So
yeah, and I just want to say that you know, mental health is critical to the healing, right? That survivors need on their journey. And sometimes, and I won't even use therapy, because I think within Intact, we are understanding that there are less formal paths to healing as well. And so therapy is one of those, right? And I think I can't remember which panelist it was I think it was Arlene was talking about we have to be clear of our own biases and how we view those who are impacted by domestic violence. And in our first session, we talked about all of the assumptions that we have, that they're weak-minded, that there's low self-esteem, all of these things that we have because we may have never been a victim, right? Or some of us have been, and so we have formed our, or our parents were, and so we have formed our opinions. And so all of that plays into the way that we interact with survivors. And so I would just encourage you all to continue, as those who are clinicians and support workers and all of that, to really do your own work, as Arlene said, to get as much training as you can on IPV. This is a great start so that you can truly understand the impact and understand the dynamics. And also understand best practices. And I'm really excited to say that our last session, which will be next Monday, will focus on best practices for clinicians. And so we'll have a whole panel of clinicians dedicated to that topic. But you all play a critical role. And you can be very harmful in your practices, or you can be critically important. And so I think it's, you know, or critically helpful, I'm sorry, in helping that survivor to build her self-esteem, to build his or her personal agency, to say, you can do this, right? The other thing that I'll add, and Karen, I see your hand, is to understand that IPV and mental health are not the same. Sometimes we like to see them that, hey, because someone has been a victim, they absolutely have a mental health issue, whatever that is, that both of those things may coexist and they need to be addressed individually, but don't automatically put those together, right? That co-occurrence happens, but there's a specific way to support IPV and to support survivors. And there's a specific way that we support if that survivor has a diagnosis such as depression or something like that. So just don't blend those things together, because they're not always, they're not ever the same. They have different responses. So I'm going to, we have a couple more questions, but Karen, your hand is up. So I'm going to give you a moment to ask your question. You can't unmute. Let's see. Can you unmute yourself? Joanne, is there any way to help Karen unmute? I'm sorry.
There we go. She should be able to now.
There we go. Thank you. I'm just going to piggyback now off what you just finished saying. I am a nurse manager on a child adolescent unit. And unfortunately, we do receive quite a few of the males and females on the adolescent side that are hiding some of their DV because it's not comfortable to talk about. So they're behind the depression, they're behind the suicide attempts, they're behind all of that. So I think as practitioners here, because they're with us for such a short time on the units, on the inpatient units, because they're just not being approved to stay much longer than what they're staying, that we listen so closely and intently and proactively when they're showing those little peaks of hey, this sounds like it might be DV, or this sounds like maybe their parents have been dealing with this and now they're a victim as well too. So I do think it's just truly, truly important to catch them when they're in your space, and make that space as comfortable as possible for them to share their information, and no longer hide behind the stigma, which is becoming greater and greater every day. And the abusers are becoming younger and younger every day, unfortunately. So thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you, Karen. And we are going to finish our, thank you for that, Karen. We're going to just ask, I'm gonna ask maybe another question or two, and then we'll open up for anyone else that has questions. We want to make sure that we acknowledge that. The other thing that I'm going to put out there for my therapist, no couples counseling. I just want to put that out there. It can be so harmful. So again, come next Monday, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, you're talking about something that can be really, really harmful to survivors. So if you think that there's IPV, I want you to think really carefully about bringing the perpetrator and survivor in for couples counseling, because it can be really, really harmful. All right. So as we wrap up and as we open up for more questions, and Adam, I see your hand, so we'll acknowledge you in just a minute. But I wanted to add this question. How has systemic racism and inequities impacted survivors who we mentioned earlier, those from historically marginalized and oppressed communities, in your experience? Because we have this lens of equity and anti-racism within Intact. And so we want to make sure that we highlight that. What has been your experience with systemic racism and how that shows up for survivors? Let's take Rachel, for example, right? Rachel was identified to be a Black woman, and we saw some of what was happening. So I'm just curious how that shows up in your opinion. And if it has any impact.
Someone mentioned earlier, and I don't know if it was one of the panelists or in the chat, but someone mentioned perpetrators who are in law enforcement themselves or in some sort of power dynamic themselves. And those are the cases I remember being the hardest to help survivors access safety. And I think about especially a case in particular, a woman married to a law enforcement officer who she was not a U.S. citizen, and was pregnant, and was making so many hard decisions about her own, about whether she was going to keep the baby, whether she was going to have an abortion, how she was going to survive, knowing that everyone in the system basically had his back, and was going to have his back. Like, there was no way for her to access any type of resources within the criminal justice system. And I think it's easy for us to forget that those experiences just increase the risk for homicide, increase the risk for poverty, for all the different components of the work. And someone who, I'll just speak from a white woman's perspective in terms of doing advocacy work, that I have not always been I've not always understood those dynamics, and how important it is for us to listen to all survivors, but in particular survivors who've experienced oppression and from marginalized communities and women of color, so that we are really growing in our ways to help, our knowledge about how to help all types of survivors.
Thank you, Brandy.
And I'll just add, marginalized and oppressed individuals, survivors, historically, I've done this work for decades, and they continue to be re-victimized by systems, right? And by individuals working in systems. And one thing that comes to mind that can make it really clear for everyone as I make this statement is, I remember a survivor, a Black woman, a phrase, a statement that was brought to my attention, saying she didn't realize how Black she was until she left her relationship. because
Wow.
the systems that she had to engage with was more abusive than her actual relationship. So bringing that into this space, implicit bias shows up, anti-Blackness shows up, a cookie cutter approach, right? That doesn't take cultural aspects or identities into consideration. Just the lack of support actually also for advocates of color who then are working with survivors of color and individuals from marginalized and oppressed groups, and just wellness, right? Wellness is not something that's talked about within organizations as it relates to the individuals that's actually doing the work. And oftentimes policies and practices are not reviewed through an equity lens, right? People inherit policies, inherit practices, inherit protocols, and just continue to implement them without assessing. And so therefore, again, it leads back to survivors not receiving the services that they need, and also, continue to be abused by a system that's set up to support.
Thank you for that, Arlene. And you had any
I
thoughts?
just want to say, yeah, I agree with what Arlene's saying too about just being able, just carrying forward with whatever was there and not taking time to question. Communities change too, the makeup changes of communities, and you can't, take what was being done 30 or 40 years ago and just keep carrying it through. You have to be able to have those kinds of conversations within your organizations, within your professions, and ask sometimes hard questions and be willing to hear what people have to say about how it feels to have experienced your service or the interaction with you. And I think where I've learned the most over 25 years is by listening to women and having them sometimes come up to me after a support group and say, hey, you know what, when you said such and such, it bothered me, and let me tell you why. And me being willing to hear that, and not getting offended by it, or not think, well, that's not what I meant, or I wasn't trying to say that, or of course you may not have been trying to say something, or you might not have meant something, but that doesn't mean that the person didn't receive it in a way that made them feel uncomfortable or bad. Or so to me, that's a big piece of the importance of just being willing to step us outside of your own feelings for a minute, to hear what somebody else has to say and how they responded to something or how something felt for them.
Thank you for that, Angie. Yeah. And I think what you also too, just listening to survivors and taking what they say about systems as true. Because sometimes we're like, well, it's not always that. Yes, it is. If they feel like, someone is being racist towards them, or the response is not the same, you want to listen to that and not try to downplay it, right? Because sometimes we're like, well, I don't get where your experience is different. And so whether it's, again, someone who's in a same-sex relationship and the bias that, is experienced as it relates to that, someone who, is, has immigration or language barriers and things like that, we just want to be careful and understand that they need additional support, that our systems are not created for them. And so in order to truly be equitable, we got to go above and beyond, because they're already facing a deficit, right? It's already hard enough for Black, Indigenous, people of color to get services without being victims. So you talk about layering on intimate partner violence, and it's even, that much more difficult. And we can't think about also that the privileges that some of our survivors have, who may be white and come from affluent families and all these kind of things, may not be their benefit. And so they can't just leave. It's not as easy. They need additional support. And so those are things that you just want to keep in mind as you think about how to support survivors. And so my last, go ahead, Arlene, you were going to say something?
Yeah, the one thing I want to add, oftentimes it's hard. I think Angie mentioned it. When we look internal at ourselves and our organization, that's difficult. We can point fingers easily. That system over there, that system over there, right? So I think it's the the internal piece that's really critical, because it's in the chat, someone said it as well. It starts with us. It starts with our organization. Because we can easily say that system is not working. I think you mentioned it, Gia, right? But you know, we need to clarify that system is working. It's working as it was created to work, right? Right. So the system is working because that's how it was intended to work. It was intended to you know, deem some people you know, worthy of living a life violence free, while others are not worthy of the same, right? And the same level of support. So I think, yeah, being able to look internal and within your organization, within yourself, and then you can go external.
So I want to get to the couple of questions that we have, but I wanted to know, was there anything else that you wanted to offer as we wrap up our panel and open up the floor for questions, just for anybody who wants to be more responsive to the needs of survivor, you know, who's a system leader? Is there any additional advice that you may, you know, give them from your perspective that we haven't already shared?
I know this is probably not a profound statement for mental health providers, but it definitely has stuck with me the first time I heard it, and relates so much to the work of serving survivors. But it's the idea that defensiveness prevents growth. And that if we are walking in that way, whether it be as an individual, a mental health provider, or a system leader, an organizational leader, if our first approach, or even our second approach or third approach, is defensiveness, then we are really, we're not going to grow. We're not going to move forward in the way that we need to.
Thank you for that. That is profound. For whoever said it first.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you say that once again?
Defensiveness prevents growth.
Yeah.
I'm putting it in the chat. Arlene, any parting last words?
In addition to what you had mentioned before around collaborating with domestic intimate partner violence and domestic violence programs, I think it's also important when we talk about intersectionality is to show up for issues that's interconnected, right? To intimate partner violence, racial inequities, and really listen to social justice movements, right? So we're not reinventing the wheel. There's a lot of organizations that can inform us about how to approach our work through an equity lens. So you're not recreating, you're listening to marginalized and oppressed communities and taking the lead from organizations that do social justice work every day. 24/7, 365, right? They are the experts. So, you know, connecting again with social justice organizations, domestic violence organizations, listening and trusting and believing individuals who identify with marginalized communities and populations.
Thank you, Arlene. Angie, any final words for folks?
Just I think really looking at the complicated issues that we're seeing all the time with this, it's not easy to muddle through what's happening in some of the families that we're coming in contact with, but to keep encouraging those open communications and coming to the table with people, and you know, I don't think that the domestic violence movement really got much credit for the peer model that is being used so much now. But I think we were kind of the first ones to do it almost with at least I'm going to say that. I know we've seen it in mental health and substance misuse too, but the peer models are really just something to kind of throw out there to connect within your communities if they have them, especially with substance misuse. Because if you can educate that peer on the dynamics of coercive control, for a woman who may be struggling with substances or mental health or child welfare cases, that having that peer to walk through with them sometimes I think has been a great benefit in the area that I've seen with a lot of the families. So that was just sort of a final thought. If that's going on in your community anywhere, maybe tap into it a little and give them the domestic violence education so they can have that holistic approach with mental health and substance misuse.
No, that's a great point, because I think all of this advocacy work is sophisticated now, but it really started with women helping women. victims help
Yes.
victims, right? To be able to
Yes.
say, hey, I know what you're going through. So
Mhm.
that definitely is a staple in the work that we do, as well as in mental health. So I wanted to offer a little space for a couple of questions, and you can raise your hand if you have a question for the panel. We can probably take about 2 with the time that we have left. So if you have a burning question that hasn't been, or anything you just want to offer, we want to give you some space. Go ahead, Adam.
First off, thank you, ladies, for your input today and being able to do this. I work for a company in which my job is I advocate and help advocate for people with disabilities that have been sexually abused or abused in other ways, domestic violence, IPV, and I'm also a survivor myself. And I think sometimes when you all were speaking about inequality and the marginal population of people affected, I think that one of the struggles, at least from my perspective and the people that I work with, is that our demographic is hardly ever recognized. And in fact, our demographic, at least in the area I work, which is Kentucky, is statistically the most taken advantage of, that is reported, the most taken advantage of, and done so in a serial manner. And one of the aspects that make that even harder, when we were talking about how to speak to survivors and taking things into account, is that in some cases, particularly with my clients or the people that work with the clients, these survivors don't communicate in a conventional way, or they don't have the ability to.
Yeah.
They might have some developmental or intellectual disabilities, or variables that don't let them communicate in a traditional way. And so you've got all that on top of trying to speak in plain language, trying to make sure everyone's on top, the overwhelming factors of what's going on, the processes, the legal processes. And I guess I was just wanting to contribute that as another variable on top of what you all have already beautifully said, as another perspective of that, from where I am and who I work with. So in agreement to everything that you guys have said. So thank you very much. I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you so much, Adam, for bringing and centering those with disabilities in this conversation. I think we all think about them when we say that phrase, but I think really pointing out that there's some additional barriers that are faced there. So thank you so much for sharing that. Anyone else has a question? I saw another hand, but I don't see it anymore. Any other questions or comments for the panel? All right. Okay, Parrish, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Why are the systems so at odds with one another? When did that shift happen in the realm of, I don't even know. What happened that the systems seem to be so at odds with one another?
Any thoughts about that, panelists?
Oh, yes, Lion, somebody dropped it in the chat. When we shifted to being more grant focused versus people focused, people centered, right? And fighting for crumbs. Everybody, all the different systems fighting for crumbs, and we shifted our focus from really being survivor centered and people centered to being more focused on numbers and grant requirements.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Experience. In my experience, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's critical, because I think it does, and it created silos, right? And so a lot of the work now is to get back to being family centered, people centered, which was the reason why we're doing the work. and also to break up the silos, because there are silos even within systems, right? Because people are competing and all that kind of stuff. So we can get back to why we were created. Adam, did you have another comment?
Yes, I'm sorry. I don't mean to monopolize anyone's time.
Go
I know
ahead.
there's other people that need to ask questions, but I forgot something I wanted to add while we were talking about language and how to speak. One thing that we've run across and our supervisors and people I work with is not only plain language, but when working in this perspective of working with someone with a disability or a marginal population or anyone in general, really, is it's not only important of knowing what to say, how to say it, but also what not to say. And what is meant by that is not hiding information or keeping things, because you don't want to bring it up or you don't think they can handle it, but assumptions in the fact that if you're meeting with someone, like we said before, person of color might be met with certain expectations or standards that are brought to the table, and those assumptions lead the way. And that's basically what I'm saying, is that even in this, from my perspective, I've been in situations where not only myself, but people I've worked with, agencies will start talking to the guardian or someone instead of the individual themselves. And that's the assumption that they can't communicate or that they're not in control of their own situation. And that may very well be true, but it's already starting that line of communication of, this is my expectation of the victim, and that's not appropriate if you want a healthy advocacy to go on. So that's just something I wanted to add. I will be quiet now and let other people jump in. So thank you very much.
No, we didn't have a whole line. Nobody else was saying anything. So we appreciate you and sharing your perspective.
All right, thank you.
All right. So I want to make sure that we end on the time that we said we would end. So I want to take this time to thank our panelists again for taking time out of your busy day to be with us, to share your expertise and experience. And I think it was a really robust conversation and something that we need more of. I want to also thank each of you all for joining us today, for also taking time out to just be a part of the conversation, whether you said anything or not. We appreciate you coming and just getting some more information about IPV and how to support survivors. I invite you all to our last session, which will be our 5th session next Monday at the same time, where we are going to talk about best practices for mental health clinicians. And that's where we're going to go deeper into the do's and don'ts, that whole couples counseling and all that kind of stuff. And how do we support those who have caused harm and all that good stuff. So I invite you, if you haven't already registered for that, to please register. Again, you will receive a certificate after this session. You'll also receive the recording from this session and any slides. And so again, thank you for your time today. I wish you all a good rest of your week and hope to see you all next week. Take care.